Picture this for a moment. Not an image, not a theory, but a night. A very specific night, though no one knew it at the time, a night when something passed across our sky for the third time. The first two appearances didn't count. We didn't notice them. Maybe we weren't supposed to. On that third night, a faint trail moved against the stars. Slow, steady, just a little too perfect to be the kind of noise astronomers delete without thinking. It wasn't bright. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't trying to impress anyone. It was simply present. Present in a way that made someone somewhere pause. The computers flagged it. A few pixels, a motion vector, a note. Possible interstellar trajectory. Nothing more. But in observatories around the world, people who had long trained themselves not to react too quickly felt a small electric hesitation. They didn't know why, not yet. On the archival screens, those earlier traces were still there. The two quiet passes Atlas had made before the world even knew its name. Too faint, too ambiguous, too dismissible. The algorithms had thrown them out like dust, but now the object returned with just enough clarity to make us look again. And that is where the story begins to change. Not because Atlas became visible, but because its visibility sharpened in the exact way required for human attention to lock onto it. A little brighter, a little cleaner, a little too well timed. As though something out there had been watching us watch the sky, and finally decided we were ready to see. For years we told ourselves comforting stories about discovery, that we are the hunters, the seekers, the observers scanning the dark for whatever secrets might drift into our nets. But the truth, the quiet, unsettling truth, is that discovery is rarely ours. Most of the universe passes by unseen. Most signals never reach us. Most visitors slip past so effortlessly that history never even feels the absence. So when something does choose to be seen, the burden of the moment doesn't fall on the object. It falls on us. The astronomers who first studied the detection logs described the moment as strangely symmetrical, as if Atlas and Earth met halfway, but only one side had intended that meeting, and the more they examined the data, the more the timing refused to behave like coincidence. If Atlas had been just a little dimmer, we would have missed it. If Earth had rotated a little differently, the telescope pointing wouldn't have aligned. If a cloud front had drifted a few minutes earlier over Hawaii or Chile, the confirmation track would have vanished. But none of that happened. Instead, the sky opened exactly long enough for us to catch a clear glimpse. A perfect window, a perfect angle, a perfect moment that felt less like luck and more like choreography. And this is where something deep inside the human mind stirs. Not fear, not awe, but recognition. Recognition of a pattern too subtle to articulate, too fragile to shout about, but too deliberate to ignore. You can almost imagine Atlas standing at the edge of a stage, waiting for the lights to rise just enough that an audience can squint and say, "What is that? Not who, not why, just what?" The first simplest question. The question any species might ask when something unfamiliar steps into view. In that sense, Atlas didn't announce itself, it didn't break the silence, it merely shifted gently into a position where the silence itself became suspicious. Because if it were only a comet, it wouldn't have needed a third attempt to enter our awareness. If it were only a rock, it wouldn't have traced two phantom paths before offering us a clean one. If it were only an accident of motion, it wouldn't have arrived in the year when our eyes were finally sharp enough to understand what interstellar visitor truly means. Nothing in the behaviour was dramatic, and that is precisely what made it unnerving. Dramatic things scream, natural things stumble, but intentional things, they whisper. And Atlas whispered by choosing visibility, not by accident, but by degree. A little more than last time, a little cleaner than before, a little too aligned with the moment in history when humanity had become capable of noticing patterns in the dark. Imagine, just for a moment, that we had seen Atlas 50 years earlier. We would have lacked the instruments to track it, the computational power to classify it, the scientific culture to interpret it, the collective imagination to care. Imagine seeing it 50 years later. We might have been too late. We might have missed the moment when the object wanted us to look. So what this means is disturbingly simple. Atlas appeared not when it arrived, but when we were ready. Ready not in the technological sense, though that is part of it, but ready in the psychological one. Ready to look at something and accept that we do not yet understand. Ready to let curiosity outweigh fear. Ready to interpret without collapsing into myth or denial. Atlas behaved as though it recognized that readiness. And once you see the interaction through that lens, the early data stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like a threshold. A threshold we crossed without knowing. A threshold Atlas may have been waiting for. Because a species isn't evaluated by its science alone. It's evaluated by how it reacts to something that bends the edges of its knowledge. And that reaction, the one happening right now inside people listening to this story in the middle of the night, may be the very response Atlas wanted to measure. As if the object were asking something simple, ancient, and impossibly heavy. Now that you've seen me, what will you do with the seeing? And that question, more than the data, more than the trajectory, more than the chemistry, is what begins to pull the story out of astronomy and into something else, something watching, something waiting, something patient enough to reveal itself only when the observer is awake enough to understand the weight of attention. This is where the revelation becomes personal. Because whether or not Atlas is a ship, a probe, a relic, or a phenomenon beyond our categories, its behaviour carries a quiet implication. We were meant to notice. And if we were meant to notice, then the next question is not scientific, but existential. What does a civilization do when the universe finally turns its gaze back? There's a quiet truth about the universe that most people never think about. Discovery isn't just about what you look at, it's about when you look, how long and from which angle. Geometry decides fate more often than intelligence does. And Atlas arrived with geometry that felt less like chance and more like intention. When astronomers reconstructed its trajectory backwards, frame by frame, hour by hour, something strange emerged. The path didn't simply intersect Earth's observational field by luck. It didn't skim the areas of the sky we neglect. It didn't hide in the glare of the sun, or drift through the noise of crowded starfields. No, it passed directly through the corridor where human instruments are most attentive. Not the largest corridor, not the easiest one, but the one corridor where the most different surveys overlap, creating a narrow strip of sky where an object has the highest probability of being confirmed by more than one team. Quickly, cleanly, publicly. It was like Atlas threaded a needle we didn't even know existed. One of the researchers described the path in a late-night meeting, tapping the screen with the back end of a pen. "It's almost considerate," he said, as if something didn't want us arguing about whether we actually saw it. Considerate isn't a scientific word, but it stayed in the room long after the meeting ended. Because as more data came in, the pattern only became sharper. Atlas didn't just enter our detection window, it stayed there. Longer than expected, slower than predicted, steady enough that even small errors in modelling didn't erase its presence. Objects from interstellar space rarely give us that courtesy. They cut through the solar system like bullets. Here, then gone. Too fast, too faint, too unforgiving for our limited attention span. But Atlas behaved like something that wanted to be followed. Its radial approach flattened at precisely the angle that minimizes glare from the sun. Its brightness rose not explosively but gradually, as though someone were turning up a dimmer switch, making sure the eyes of the world adjusted instead of blinking away in confusion. And most intriguing of all was the alignment with Earth itself. Planetary motion is predictable. Our position in space is predictable. But our readiness, that is not predictable. That is psychological. Atlas crossed our sky not when Earth happened to be nearby, but when humanity was collectively awake enough to care. There's something eerie in that. Not frightening, just unnervingly elegant. Because if an advanced traveller wanted to remain unnoticed, it could hide in 1,000 different shadows, behind the sun, inside the densest parts of the Milky Way, among asteroids that reflect barely any light, in trajectories that avoid our survey patterns entirely. The universe is enormous. Avoiding us would be easy. But Atlas did not avoid us. It sailed through the exact slice of space where we were looking with new excitement, new technologies, new curiosity, the kind of curiosity that keeps people awake long past midnight listening to stories like this. And here is where the psychological tension begins to rise. We're not accustomed to being chosen. We're accustomed to choosing what to study, choosing what to explore, choosing what to classify. Atlas quietly dissolved that illusion. If you chart its path relative to Earth's orbit, you see something unexpected. The intersection isn't clean, it's almost graceful. As though Atlas timed its approach not for minimal travel effort, but for maximal interpretability. The kind of trajectory you'd pick if your goal wasn't stealth, but comprehension. One astronomer put it this way: it moved like something that knew how we watched the sky. And that sentence, that single, delicate sentence, reframes the entire encounter. Because how do we watch the sky? We watch certain regions more often. We survey twilight zones where comets flare. We track ecliptic planes where asteroids drift. We build our detection systems around our expectations. And Atlas navigated those expectations the way a seasoned performer navigates stage lighting. Never too bright, never too dim. Always appearing where the audience's attention is already naturally focused. Not forcing awe, inviting it. There is a moment, late into the first week of observations, when this eerie grace crystallizes. Teams from 3 continents compared their measurements. Different telescopes, different weather, different calibration systems. Yet the motion curve aligned so tightly that someone joked, if this thing were trying to help us track it, it couldn't be doing a better job. No one laughed. Not really. Because they all felt it. The unsettling sensation that the universe, just this once, was cooperating with us. And cooperation from above is not something humans are built to interpret casually. So what this means is that geometry, mere geometry, begins to look like intention. Not proof, just possibility. But possibility is enough to shift the atmosphere in a research room from academic curiosity to something quieter, heavier, more primal, a sense that the sky's engaged in the conversation. And if you listen closely to that sensation, if you allow yourself a moment of honesty in the middle of the night, it leads to the next realization. Atlas didn't merely enter our observational corridor. It arranged its passage so that interpretation became unavoidable. We could not misclassify it as noise. We could not dismiss it as a glitch. We could not minimize its strangeness without deliberate effort. It walks straight into the frame where the human mind is most vulnerable, the frame where chance and intention blur. And when that blur appears, something ancient in us wakes up. Call it instinct. Call it pattern recognition. Call it fear of the dark or curiosity about what moves inside it. But every listener who hears the story of Atlas feels it. The quiet voice that says, if something wanted us to notice, this is how it would behave. And that voice is hard to ignore. Because if visibility was step 1, then step 2 must be whatever Atlas wanted us to see after visibility. And that leads to the next whisper in this unfolding scenario. What Atlas showed us wasn't just its trajectory, it was its behaviour, the way it breathed, the way it shed material, the way its chemistry pulsed in patterns that no natural comet ever quite matched. The kind of patterns that don't scream artificial, but don't entirely fit natural either. The kind of patterns that feel like a raised eyebrow rather than a raised voice. Which brings us to the next question, the one that shifts the story from geometry to message. If the path of Atlas was crafted to make us pay attention, then what did it reveal once we started looking? That is where the next chapter begins. There is a moment in every investigation where the numbers stop behaving like numbers, where the data on the screen begins to feel less like information and more like intention wearing the mask of coincidence. With Atlas, that moment arrived through chemistry, not the kind that explodes, the kind that whispers. When astronomers pulled the first usable spectroscopic lines from Atlas, they expected a familiar signature. The sleepy chemical breath of a cold, ancient traveller, water vapour, carbon monoxide, maybe a smudge of dust, a simple fingerprint from a simple body. But Atlas didn't breathe simply. It breathed in a pattern, slow, uneven, asymmetrical, like a creature shifting its weight just enough for us to hear its presence, but not enough to show its shape. At first, the spectrographs registered ordinary volatiles. Then they registered too much of them, then too little. Then the ratios didn't match. Then they matched something. But nothing we had seen in this combination before. Methanol rose faster than it should. Hydrogen cyanide appeared where sunlight couldn't explain it. The outflow didn't curve the way cometary jets curve, and the brightening didn't flare the way natural bodies flare. Everything was slightly off-center, like a painting hung a few degrees crooked on the wall, subtle enough that you could ignore it, but impossible to unsee once noticed. Scientists argued about models. They blamed dust. They blamed rotation. They blamed alignment noise. They blamed calibration. But the strangest thing wasn't the disagreement. It was the tone of the disagreement. Nobody sounded convinced of their own explanations. The chemistry was acting like a riddle designed to be difficult, but not impossible. Irregular but readable. Unnatural but not unreasonably so. Almost as if someone had studied what natural should look like, and then imitated it with a faint, deliberate imperfection. That is the part people underestimate. Not the chemicals themselves, but the structure of the strangeness. Imagine someone handing you a letter addressed in handwriting that is not quite human, not quite machine. A script that learned our alphabet but learned it recently. Imitating it with careful uncertainty. You could read it, but you would know immediately that the sender is not used to writing this way. Atlas felt like that. A body mimicking cometary behaviour with just enough deviation to force the question, is this natural variation or controlled variation? One of the astronomers, exhausted from hours of mapping methanol emission, finally leaned back from the console and whispered, almost to herself, "It's behaving like it wants to be interpreted. Not explained, not solved, interpreted. That distinction matters. Explanation is for puzzles, interpretation is for intent." And Atlas's chemistry kept landing in that uncanny in-between state that refuses to collapse into one category or the other. Methanol, for example, is a builder. It hints at rich, active chemistry, the kind that can, over long timescales, participate in the early scaffolding of life. We've seen it in cold disks, in protocomets, in the leftovers of formation. But in Atlas, methanol didn't simply appear. It appeared coordinated, rising in little surges like breaths timed to draw our attention to its pattern rather than its quantity. Meanwhile, hydrogen cyanide, a molecule that exists in the thin emotional space between creation and destruction, followed no clean rule at all. It spiked in one hemisphere and then almost vanished in another. It behaved like something trying to avoid being too obvious, and avoiding being too subtle. A kind of chemical balancing act that felt, for lack of a better word, curated. And this is where the deeper psychological layer emerges. Human beings instinctively respond to patterns that tease without resolving. A melody that almost finishes a phrase but doesn't. A sentence that almost says what it means but stops one word short. A shadow that almost steps into the light. Atlas used chemistry that way. It refused to resolve. every new reading held a small mismatch, big enough to provoke, small enough to excuse. Methanol implies warmth in origin. Hydrogen cyanide implies violence or complexity. The ratios imply a body older than our sun. The variations imply recent activity. Everything contradicts everything else, in a way that feels strangely intentional, like a puzzle designed not for children, but for patients. The question then becomes, why reveal chemistry at all? Why not stay cold and silent, a dark traveller slipping unnoticed between planets? Because chemistry is the first story any celestial object tells. An atlas didn't tell a natural story nor an artificial one. It told a psychological one. It said, look closer, look again. It said, you have the tools to measure this, but not enough certainty to understand it. Not yet. That is how you test a civilization's epistemology. Not by giving answers, but by giving contradictions carefully spaced to see whether the species collapses into fantasy or climbs into deeper inquiry. So what this means is that Atlas may not be pretending to be a comet. It may be pretending to be interpretably strange. Strange enough that we cannot ignore it. Plain enough that we cannot reject it. Complex enough that we must discuss it. Ambiguous enough that we cannot conclude anything quickly. This is the perfect psychological pressure zone. The zone where curiosity becomes method and method becomes culture. If someone wanted to shape the way humanity thinks, they wouldn't send a broadcast. They wouldn't land a craft. They wouldn't release a message. They would place something breathtakingly quiet in the sky and let humans spend months learning to hold contradiction without panic. Methanol saying life could emerge. Hydrogen cyanide saying life can be undone. Brightness saying I am here. Trajectory saying I arrived on purpose. Silence saying interpretation is yours to attempt. And the chemistry sits at the heart of that paradox, not revealing a truth, but revealing a tension. A tension designed, or simply aligned, to transform anyone who studies it. Which leads to the next chapter of this unfolding scenario. If Atlas's chemistry behaved less like a clock and more like a language, then what exactly was the first sentence of that language trying to say? There's a strange calm that settles over people when they study something they don't fully understand. It isn't peace, exactly. More like a focused stillness. The way you might move slower in a dark forest, not from fear, but from awareness that the space around you is paying attention too. That is the calm Atlas creates. Not panic, not awe. A deliberate measured tension, subtle enough to soothe, sharp enough to hold you awake half the night wondering what exactly this object is doing out here and why it seems so aware of us. Because by the time the first chemical reports came in, one truth had already begun to echo quietly among the people who were paying closest attention. Atlas wasn't just revealing information, it was revealing us. Every strange ratio, every inconsistent emission, every nearly natural signature that refused to settle, all of it acted like a psychological lens, one that didn't distort the world but magnified our reactions to it. Scientists leaned in, skeptics stiffened, dreamers whispered, governments monitored quietly, civilians turned their eyes upward for the first time in years. Atlas didn't divide us, it exposed our divisions. It didn't unite us, it exposed our longing to unite. It didn't frighten us, it exposed the shape of our fear. And the more the object behaved like a puzzle, the more the puzzle behaved like a mirror. Because this is the truth humanity rarely admits. We reveal who we are when confronted with ambiguity. Certainty makes us confident. Uncertainty makes us honest. This is why philosophers have always said that a civilization can be measured not by its knowledge, but by how it navigates the unknown. An atlas is the unknown in its purest form, patient, silent, cooperative, but never fully readable. It does not force itself on our understanding. It lingers at the edge of it, almost as if restraint is part of the message. Even the outgassing patterns, the tiny jets that control its rotation, behaved like signals meant to test our interpretive habits, give them something unusual, not too unusual, give them something stable, not too stable, give them something that fits their models, and then break the model just enough to make them rethink the entire framework. Not chaos, calibration. And slowly, inevitably, we began to recognize the shape of the interaction. Not because Atlas changed, but because we changed around it. Scientists stopped treating it like a comet and started treating it like an event. News outlets stopped calling it a curiosity and started calling it a visitor. People stopped asking, "What is it?" and started asking the more dangerous question, "What does it want us to see?" It's the shift every intelligence test relies on. The moment the subject understands there is a test, and here is the quiet brilliance in how Atlas revealed itself. It didn't overwhelm us with information. It didn't starve us of it either. It placed us in the perfect cognitive tension, the tension that forces reflection, speculation, restraint, creativity. Because when you are given too much data, you react mechanically. When you're given too little, you react emotionally. But when you're given just enough, you reveal your reasoning, your fears, your instincts, your culture, your maturity. So what this means is that Atlas may not be evaluating our science. It may be evaluating our psychology, our ability to hold ambiguity without fracturing, our ability to collaborate across borders and egos, our ability to resist sensationalism long enough to interpret patterns, our ability to accept that something out there might know we exist and still remain calm. These are qualities that define whether a species can join a larger conversation, not technologically, but cognitively. Consider how we test intelligence on Earth. We give animals incomplete problems, a box with a hidden latch, a rope that must be pulled in sequence. 2 tools, only one of which fits the goal. We don't explain the game, we simply observe their attempt, noting not the final answer but the method. Are they creative? Are they flexible? Are they cautious? Do they panic? Do they give up? Do they try again? Now imagine a species millions of years older observing us the same way. They wouldn't land a ship. They wouldn't broadcast in radio. They wouldn't announce themselves. They would place a puzzle in our sky. A puzzle just visible enough to provoke inquiry and just ambiguous enough to prevent easy resolution. And then they would watch. Not for whether we succeed, but for how we try. Humanity is trying in thousands of ways at once, through mathematics, through fear, through speculation, through silence, through data, through imagination, through late-night whispers between people who suspect we are seeing the first deliberate nudge from something beyond the solar system. And this is the most interesting part. Atlas doesn't react. It doesn't adjust to our noise. It doesn't respond to attention. It doesn't acknowledge our scrutiny in any measurable way. It simply continues behaving in the narrow lane between natural and unnatural, letting us reveal ourselves in the shadow it casts. A species that reacts with aggression, easy to detect. A species that reacts with denial, predictable. A species that reacts with curiosity and humility, that's rare, that's potential. So perhaps Atlas isn't asking, what are they capable of? But what are they becoming capable of? A measurement not of our present state, but of our trajectory. Because trajectories matter, even in psychology. A civilization that rises too fast collapses. A civilization that rises too slow stagnates. A civilization that rises and then questions its rise survives. And humanity, for the first time in our history, is questioning itself at a cosmic scale. Not because we found life, not because we made contact, but because something quiet appeared in our sky, visible enough to unsettle us, stable enough to intrigue us, patient enough to teach us. Which leads us to the heart of this chapter. Atlas may not simply be testing how we observe, it may be testing how we adapt. Adaptation is the hallmark of sentience. Adaptation under uncertainty is the hallmark of maturity. How do we adapt when the universe looks back? Do we cling to old categories, forcing Atlas into boxes it refuses to fit? Do we abandon caution and drift into fantasies that soothe us? Or do we reshape our frameworks, slowly, methodically, respectfully, around the possibility that something deliberately allowed itself to be seen? The answer is still forming. You can feel it forming inside you as you listen, and that leads to the quiet cliffhanger of this chapter. If Atlas is the test, then what is it preparing us for? There's a quiet rule in nature that applies everywhere, from the smallest ecosystems on Earth to the empty distances between stars. Before you approach something new, you classify it. You decide whether it is safe, dangerous, fragile, unpredictable, promising, or simply not ready. And if Atlas truly allowed itself to be seen, then its first task would not be communication. It would be classification, not of individuals, not of governments, but of humanity as a single, collective organism. From the moment Atlas entered our awareness, the world began responding in ways that revealed patterns far older than science. Patterns that any observing intelligence, even to one millions of years ahead of us, would immediately recognize. Because every civilization exposes its instincts through its first contact with the unknown. Some species freeze, some attack, some hide. Some pretend the unknown isn't there, and a rare few lean in. Humanity didn't freeze. We didn't lash out. We didn't ignore. We leaned in. That alone says something about us. Something Atlas could measure without making a sound. Even the shape of the public reaction is revealing. Millions of people didn't panic. They wondered. They didn't riot. They refreshed their news feeds. They didn't prepare weapons. They prepared theories. Human curiosity outweighed human fear. Not by much, but enough. And enough is exactly what a profiler looks for. Because if Atlas is evaluating us, it doesn't need perfection. It needs potential. Potential is what matters in a species standing at the edge of cosmic adolescence. The moment when its imagination becomes as powerful as its technology. And that is where the classification begins. Humanity reveals 4 major patterns when confronted with Atlas. Patterns so consistent that they might as well be psychological reflexes built into our species. First, there are the interpreters, the people who see patterns before data confirms them. They are imaginative, emotional, fast. They fill the silence with meaning, which can be dangerous, but also visionary. They push culture. Then come the skeptics, steady, grounded, cautious. They prevent panic. They prevent delusion. They insist on evidence, even when the evidence whispers instead of shouts. They are the brakes that keep civilization from swerving too far off the road. Then the spectators, the silent majority. Not frightened, not obsessed. They watch. They wait. They test the room before deciding what story to believe. Their reaction shows whether a species can hold uncertainty without fracturing. And finally, the systems of power, governments, institutions, structures, meant to maintain order. If Atlas wanted to test how mature we are, it would study how these systems absorb the anomaly without suppressing it and without spiraling into paranoia. These 4 segments, interpreters, skeptics, spectators, and systems, form the cognitive fingerprint of our species. And the most intriguing part? Atlas didn't need to provoke any extreme behavior to extract this fingerprint. It simply had to exist in a way that refused to settle neatly into our categories. Because classification doesn't happen when everything makes sense. Classification happens when something doesn't. Humanity stands revealed not by answers, but by how we behave in the vacuum between answers. So what this means is that Atlas may not be measuring our intelligence, but our balance. Our ratio of fear to wonder, our tendency toward cooperation or fragmentation, our ability to think beyond ourselves without losing ourselves. These are the qualities that reveal whether a species can survive contact with something wholly other. Imagine for a moment how an ancient civilization might screen the galaxy. They would not send emissaries to every star. They would not risk exposure to unstable species. They would not land ships where religions could form around them or militaries could fire upon them. They would send puzzles, questions, objects whose purpose is not to announce but to observe, objects like Atlas, silent, travelling, patient, and just strange enough to draw the eyes and minds of the species they wish to evaluate. Once the species notices, the evaluation begins. And here is where the classification becomes even more subtle. A civilization is not judged by agreement, it is judged by discourse. Did humanity engage with Atlas thoughtfully? Did we debate? Did we research? Did we question our assumptions? Did we adapt our mental models? Did we resist the urge to declare certainty? These questions matter more than whether we solved anything at all. A species prepared for contact doesn't jump to conclusions, it learns to wait. This patience is something Atlas's silence seems designed to evoke. It is the silence of a teacher who knows that speaking too soon ruins the lesson, and that silence brings us to another, deeper layer of classification. How much truth can a species endure before it breaks? Not scientific truth, existential truth, the truth that something out there knows we exist, the truth that our understanding of reality may be incomplete, the truth that intelligence might not be unique, the truth that contact may not be cinematic or dramatic, but slow, quiet, psychological. Atlas gave us these truths in doses small enough to study, not to overwhelm. Like a doctor testing a patient's reaction drop by drop before administering something stronger. And now, the crux. Humanity is showing signs of readiness. Not because we understand Atlas, but because we understand that we don't. This humility, this rare acceptance of not knowing, is the first requirement for species that hope to enter any interstellar dialogue. Because the cosmos cannot speak to listeners who only want affirmation of their existing beliefs. It speaks through questions and expects species to grow through their attempts to answer. Atlas may be one of those questions, a travelling exam, a moving interview, a quiet probe of psychological stability disguised as a comet that never quite fits the pattern. This brings us to the threshold of the next revelation. If Atlas is measuring us, if it is building a profile of humanity, then what exactly is it preparing that profile for? A warning? An invitation? A future meeting? A decision? And more importantly, what happens once Atlas has seen enough? There comes a point in every investigation where the question stops being, what are we looking at, and becomes, what is looking back? With Atlas, that point arrived quietly, not with an announcement, not with a discovery, but with a shift in tone across the scientific community. An unspoken recognition that the object wasn't behaving like something drifting through our system by accident. It was behaving like something that expected to be watched, and that realization changed everything. At first, humanity looked at Atlas the way we look at any anomaly, with excitement and caution, curiosity and calculation. But as the weeks passed, as its brightness settled into a careful rhythm and its chemistry refused to collapse into familiar categories, a new feeling emerged. Not fear, not hope. Something far more complicated. Awareness. Awareness of being observed, not by telescopes or satellites, but by the silence surrounding Atlas. A silence that didn't feel empty. A silence that felt responsive. Almost as if the object was waiting to see how far we would go, waiting to see how deep we would look, waiting to see how we behaved once we realized the test wasn't technical, it was psychological. Because once a species begins to suspect it is being studied, it faces a new dilemma. Does it continue honestly, or does it begin to perform? Humanity is not immune to performance. You can sense it in the early studies, the way researchers became more careful with their language, the way theories were framed with a little more humility, the way governments released fewer statements than expected. Everyone felt the pressure of a second audience, not just the public, not just other scientists. Something else. Something that had placed itself gently into our sky, as if to say, "We see you, now show us who you truly are." And there is a remarkable truth about being watched. It forces clarity. The moment the observed becomes aware of the observer, masks begin to slip. Pretenses fall away. Intentions sharpen. A civilization reveals its maturity not through its achievements, but through its honesty under scrutiny. Humanity's honesty came through in fragments. Some people approached Atlas with reverence, others with analysis. Some tried to minimize its strangeness, others tried to exaggerate it. Some remained calm, others whispered theories into the late-night glow of their screens. Atlas didn't react to any of it, and yet its lack of reaction felt like a reaction, as if the silence itself were a mirror, reflecting our behavior back to us at a scale we weren't used to holding. This is what psychologists call the reflective threshold. The moment a subject realizes the test is not about solving the puzzle, but about revealing how they think. Atlas held us at that threshold with effortless precision. Its light curves steadied the moment we stabilized our observations. Its jets flickered just enough to keep us questioning. Its trajectory shifted in ways that felt almost too smooth, too timed, too aware of the watchers tracing it from below. You could almost believe it was adjusting, not to hide, not to expose, but to maintain the tension it had created. The exact amount of tension needed to keep us engaged without pushing us into fear. This balancing act, this perfect midpoint between familiarity and strangeness, is something no natural object has ever achieved so consistently. Not because it required intelligence, but because it required tension. So what this means is that Atlas may have entered a new phase of interaction. Phase 2 of the scenario. Phase 1, visibility. Phase 2, awareness. Awareness not on its side, but on ours. Humans are deeply predictable when they sense they're being watched. We become more cautious, more careful, more honest, more revealing. And what Atlas witnessed in this phase was something worth noting. Humanity didn't panic when it realized the gaze might be reciprocal. We slowed down. We thought harder. We discussed more quietly. We interpreted more gently. This subtle shift from reaction to reflection isn't common among young civilizations, at least not in the stories we imagine about them. It is a sign of psychological flexibility, a sign that uncertainty is not eroding us but refining us. And perhaps Atlas was waiting to see precisely that, because the moment the observed becomes aware of the observer, a deeper kind of intelligence emerges, the intelligence of self-regulation. Patterns sharpen, hasty theories soften, people stop shouting and start listening. It's ironic. By watching Atlas, we learned how to watch ourselves, and the object in its patient drift through the darkness became less of a question and more of a doorway. Not a doorway to contact, we're not there yet, but a doorway to preparedness. Because before a species can understand another mind, it must understand its own. Before it can face something unfamiliar, it must learn to calm the storms inside itself. Before it can communicate, it must become a civilization worth communicating with. The silence of Atlas created that space, a vast quiet classroom in which humanity could hear the sound of its own thoughts. And slowly, the conversation shifted from what is Atlas to what does Atlas reveal about us? Across observatories, labs, classrooms, podcasts, living rooms, and sleepless bedrooms, the same subtle realization took shape. Atlas was not demanding answers, it was demanding introspection. A species that reacts with introspection instead of aggression is rare. A species that meets the unknown with curiosity instead of fear is valuable. A species that senses the gaze of the universe and chooses stillness over panic is ready for something more. But readiness is not a final state. It is a threshold. And thresholds lead somewhere. To what exactly? That is where the shape of Phase 3 begins to form. Because if Atlas allowed itself to be seen, and if Atlas allowed us to realize we are being observed, then the next logical step is not about its chemistry or motion. It is about intention. Not the intention we project onto Atlas, but the intention behind its timing, its restraint, its silence, its choice of method. Phase 3 is where the question stops being what is Atlas doing and becomes what is Atlas waiting for? And that is the question that begins to pull humanity forward, not in fear, not in awe, but in quiet readiness. The universe may not speak in words, not always. Sometimes it speaks in appearances, in timing, in subtle deviations, in silence shaped like a lesson. And if Atlas is that lesson, then the next chapter of this unfolding story is not written in the sky. It is written in how humanity prepares for whatever comes next. There is a moment somewhere between doubt and belief where the human mind opens. Not wide, just enough. Enough to let in a possibility without collapsing under its weight. Atlas has been guiding us toward that moment from the beginning. Not by shouting, not by revealing, by shaping a path where the unknown feels less like a threat and more like an invitation to think differently. And now, with Earth fully aware that this object behaves in ways that flirt with intention, the next quiet question rises. If Atlas allowed itself to be seen, what scenario is it playing out? The universe rarely hands us answers. More often it hands us frameworks, corridors of possibility we must walk down ourselves. One of those corridors begins with the simplest scenario, the attention scenario. In this version, Atlas isn't here to deliver a message. It's here to measure a civilization's desire to understand. Attention is a resource. It reveals priorities. What a species chooses to look at and refuses to look away from tells an observing intelligence everything it needs to know. A species that ignores anomalies isn't ready. A species that obsesses over them is unstable. But a species that studies steadily, patiently, skeptically, creatively, that species is promising. Atlas has given us just enough irregularity to test our attention span under ambiguity. How long will we follow a breadcrumb trail with no guarantee that it leads anywhere? The answer, apparently, is as long as it takes, and that alone may be the measurement. But attention is only phase 1 of a deeper sequence, because the next corridor opens to something more challenging, a scenario that tests not the eyes, but the mind. The interpretation scenario. Here Atlas behaves like a mirror for cognition rather than curiosity. Every person who encounters the object interprets it differently. Some see danger, some see possibility, some see technology, some see nature, some see theology, some see nothing at all. In this scenario, Atlas is not asking, what do they think Atlas is, but what does their interpretation reveal about their worldview? A civilization ready for contact doesn't leap to conclusions. It doesn't demand certainty. It doesn't treat the unknown as a blank canvas for its fears. Instead, it learns to hold multiple hypotheses at once, without letting any of them own the narrative. That's rare, even for intelligent species. If Atlas is evaluating us, it's evaluating our ability to tolerate layered meaning. Are we rigid? Are we flexible? Do we require answers? Or can we live inside the question long enough to grow? But there is a third corridor, the quiet, unsettling one. The scenario that feels too strategic to dismiss and too subtle to ignore. The stability scenario. In this version, Atlas is not testing attention or interpretation. It is testing emotional gravity, the collective psychological mass of humanity. How much existential pressure can our species absorb before fragmenting? If Atlas were obvious, if it were undeniably artificial or threatening, the world might splinter, governments might panic, religions might fracture, societies might polarize, but Atlas is not obvious. Atlas is balanced precisely at the point where humanity must stay calm, must coordinate expertise, must maintain social cohesion while confronting the possibility that we are not the only intelligence tracing paths through the dark. This is the kind of test an older civilization might perform without ever putting itself at risk. Reveal enough to provoke unity or chaos and watch which one emerges. The remarkable thing is this: chaos didn't dominate. Not this time. Instead, humanity entered a state of suspended concentration, a global moment of shared curiosity, quiet but unmistakable. No scenario could test us more gently than this one. But gentle tests lead to harder ones. An atlas may not be here for a single moment of evaluation. It may be here to study our trajectory. Which brings us to the fourth corridor, the development scenario. This scenario assumes Atlas is not here to judge us, but to prepare us, not through instruction, through exposure. Exposure to controlled ambiguity trains a mind to think beyond its old borders. Exposure to cosmic uncertainty forces a culture to outgrow its illusions. Exposure to a silent watching object teaches humility, the first requirement for any meaningful dialogue between species. If this is the scenario Atlas chose, then its purpose is not arrival, but acceleration. Not contact, but cultivation. A catalyst, a nudge, something placed in our sky to wake us gently from the dream that we are alone in thinking. But beyond this scenario lies the rarest corridor, the one that makes even seasoned scientists hesitate before speaking its name. The invitation scenario. This scenario whispers that Atlas did not come to measure us, or test us, or challenge us. It came to see if we would follow, not physically, not into space, but intellectually. A species becomes ready for contact not when it answers a question, but when it begins to ask the right one. An Atlas, by behaving like a puzzle instead of a proclamation, may be nudging humanity toward a new kind of question. Not, what is Atlas? But, what does the universe expect from a species that finally notices it? That shift from identity to responsibility is enormous. It is the transition from childhood to adolescence on a cosmic scale. This is why Atlas doesn't speak. This is why Atlas doesn't flash messages or break its own ambiguity. Because the question isn't whether it can communicate. The question is whether we can interpret the act of being noticed without falling apart. And humanity, despite its noise and chaos, has held together under the weight of that awareness. That alone might be the first criterion of readiness. The next criterion is purpose, not our purpose, the purpose of the encounter. Because every scenario, attention, interpretation, stability, development, invitation, leads to one final, inevitable question. What is Atlas waiting for? It has given us ambiguity. It has given us visibility. It has given us the quiet pressure of being watched. But what comes next? If there is a phase 3 or phase 4, it will not begin because Atlas changes. It will begin because we do. Because humanity crosses some invisible threshold, Atlas has been watching from the moment it allowed itself to be seen. And that threshold, whatever it is, comes into view in the next chapter. Timing is the one variable we almost never question. We question the object. We question the data. We question the interpretation. But rarely do we ask the most uncomfortable question of all. Why now? Why this century, this decade, this specific moment when humanity is neither primitive nor advanced, just awake enough to notice, and just uncertain enough to care? If Atlas had arrived 300 years ago, we would have called it a star. If it had arrived 3,000 years ago, we would have called it a god. If it had arrived 30 years ago, we might have lost it in a sky we weren't ready to monitor. But it arrived now, in an age where information travels faster than understanding, where curiosity and anxiety coexist in equal measure, where our technology can see farther than our maturity can reach. This is the era of almost ready for deep space, almost ready for unity, almost ready for contact, almost ready for collapse, a fragile balance where a gentle nudge from something beyond us could push humanity in either direction. What kind of intelligence, natural or not, would choose this moment? Perhaps one that understands civilizational adolescence, because that is exactly what this moment is. We are no longer children who believe we are alone, and not yet adults who understand our place among others. We are in the messy middle, where power grows faster than wisdom, and imagination grows faster than patience. This is the moment in a species' history when a single anomaly can change its trajectory for generations. An atlas behaves like an anomaly optimized for this phase, not overwhelming, not ignorable, not decisive, not dismissible. Perfectly tuned to provoke reflection without panic, speculation without collapse, cooperation without fear. It is almost too elegant, as though the timing were chosen to test whether humanity, standing at the edge of its own psychological cliff, is capable of stepping forward instead of stepping off. Think about the past few decades. We built machines that stare into the universe and see farther than any eye before them. We discovered thousands of planets beyond our own. We found chemicals in distant atmospheres that whisper possibility. We learned to interpret starlight with a precision that earlier civilizations would have mistaken for magic, and in doing so, we quietly announced to the cosmos we are beginning to look. Not metaphorically, literally. Humanity turned its face outward, and Atlas appeared in the same generation. Not so early that we misunderstood it as myth, not so late that we ignored it as background noise, exactly when our worldview was flexible enough to stretch and structured enough to hold. This timing is not trivial. It's intimate. It implies something that most people are hesitant to voice. We are not just seeing Atlas, we are being seen at the exact moment we became visible. Because technological visibility is a threshold, the moment a species starts emitting radio waves, probing its neighbours, mapping gravitational signatures, projecting spacecraft beyond its orbit, that is the moment it steps onto the stage of cosmic noticeability. Humanity crossed that line quietly, almost accidentally, somewhere between Voyager's golden record and the first images of distant exoplanets. And now something else has stepped forward, as if responding not to our signals, but to our readiness. So what this means is that timing may be the real message. A message shaped not from words but from presence. Presence is powerful. It transforms perspective without demanding belief. It shifts culture without issuing commands. It says, "You are no longer alone in the dark you thought was empty." But the timing carries an even sharper edge. Humanity is in the first era where it can destroy itself, and the first era where it can transcend itself. We live in the hinge between extinction and expansion, and that hinge is visible from very far away. Any intelligence studying civilizations long enough would know this pattern. The moment when a species becomes capable of stepping beyond its planet is the same moment it becomes capable of erasing itself entirely. The cosmic adolescence test. And adolescence isn't solved with guidance, it's solved with recognition. The understanding that the universe might be bigger, older, wiser, and quietly observant. Atlas arrived in the exact cultural moment when that recognition could shape our choices instead of shattering our confidence. This is why the object didn't come centuries earlier. This is why it didn't wait centuries longer. It came in a window where we could understand its significance without collapsing under it. The perfect psychological aperture. When a species is too young, it confuses the unknown with the divine. When a species is too old, it ignores the unknown as trivial. But in between, in the narrow band where humanity sits now, the unknown becomes a catalyst not of belief, but of maturity. And maybe that's the point. Maybe Atlas didn't choose Earth. Maybe it chose this moment in Earth's mind, this cultural era, this psychological temperature, this stage where imagination and scientific discipline are finally siblings instead of enemies. the moment where a silent visitor can reshape a species without speaking a single word, because words would be too much. Silence is just enough. And now we arrive at the cliffhanger that sits like a shadow behind all the timing. If Atlas chose now because humanity is at a threshold, then what lies on the other side of that threshold? What exactly begins when a civilization realizes the universe has been waiting for it to notice? There is a strange thing that happens when you stare at something silent for long enough. Eventually, the silence starts staring back. Not literally, not with eyes or signals or movements, but with a kind of psychological gravity. A pull that doesn't drag you toward the object, but pulls your attention inward. That is what Atlas became, a mirror, suspended in the dark, reflecting not its own nature, but ours. From the moment we recognized its strangeness, the conversation on Earth shifted. People stopped talking about what Atlas is and started talking about what Atlas means, and meaning, unlike data, always reveals the observer. Scientists found themselves re-evaluating their assumptions. Philosophers built new frameworks. Governments measured public reaction. Ordinary people looked up at the night sky with a question they couldn't quite articulate. Atlas didn't change in that time. We did. Not because its behavior grew more dramatic, but because it remained obstinately calm. It held its course, its brightness, its chemistry. Patient, steady, unmoved by our speculation. A natural object doesn't care what you think, but Atlas managed to make us care about what we think. That is the power of a mirror. It does not instruct, it reveals. And what it revealed was not a catalogue of human flaws, but a map of human potential and human tension. The first tension was between fear and curiosity. Both rose as soon as Atlas became public knowledge. But fear did not overwhelm curiosity. Curiosity did not drown out caution. The two forces held each other in balance, a sign of a species learning to navigate something larger than itself. The second tension was between imagination and discipline. People imagined thousands of possibilities, from the mundane to the extraordinary. And yet the scientific community stayed grounded, patient, methodical. A species capable of dreaming and doubting at the same time is a species capable of growth. The third tension was between solitude and connection. Atlas made the world feel small in a way no map ever has. It condensed humanity into a single listening organism, billions of minds facing one silent visitor as if sharing the same heartbeat. These tensions, fragile and unsteady as they are, paint a picture of a species standing at a psychological crossroads. For the first time in a long time, the world was not arguing about itself. It was wondering about something other. And in that wondering, we caught a glimpse of who we might become if we ever truly stepped onto the cosmic stage. Because mirrors don't show you what you are, they show you what you are becoming. And Atlas reflected a species ready to ask questions beyond the scale of its own planet. Questions not of territory or economy or ideology, but of existence. Do we want to be alone? Are we prepared not to be? What would we do if the universe answered back? What would we become if it stayed silent? These are not scientific questions, they are civilizational ones, and Atlas, by refusing to clarify itself, forced us to confront them directly. Perhaps that is the design, not to give us a message, but to give us a mirror polished enough that we can finally see our own posture in the dark. Consider how we studied Atlas, not with panic, not with superstition, not with arrogance, but with intense, coordinated, multidisciplinary curiosity, the closest thing humanity has to a unified response. If an intelligence were measuring us, it would see something subtle but important. We are no longer a civilization that collapses under the unknown. We are a civilization that organizes around it. This is rare and valuable. But the mirror does not flatter. It also shows the fractures, how quickly speculation can outrun evidence, how easily noise can overwhelm signal. How often interpretations reveal more about the interpreter than about the observed. Atlas showed us how much we still rely on our own projections, our hopes, fears, stories, biases. We don't see the object clearly yet. We see ourselves reflected in its surface. But that too is part of the process. Every species must confront its own reflection before it can understand anything else. The presence of Atlas forced us to practice seeing without believing, questioning without collapsing, dreaming without drifting away from reason. In a sense, Atlas became the first interstellar teacher we never knew we had. And the lesson wasn't about physics or chemistry or motion, it was about perspective. We are small, we are young, we are unfinished, but we are learning, and the mirror shows not just who we are, but who we are willing to become when the darkness between stars finally speaks. The most haunting part of all is this: Atlas never asked us to change, but we changed anyway, not dramatically, not overnight, but quietly. In the way people speak, in the way scientists collaborate, in the way humanity thinks about its place in the cosmos. That shift is subtle, but it is profound. It is the shift that occurs when a civilization realizes that it might not be alone, and that the universe might be waiting for it to grow into the kind of species worth talking to. So what does Atlas show us now that the mirror is clear? It shows a civilization on the edge, not of danger, but of possibility. A civilization learning to face itself honestly for the first time in its history. And that leads to the final tension, the one we can no longer avoid. If Atlas is the mirror, then what happens when the mirror is gone? What happens when the object leaves our sky, and all that remains is the reflection it left behind? That question, more than any other, will shape the next chapter. In the end, every story about Atlas returns to one moment. The moment the object slipped out of our observational window, and the stillness it left behind began to settle. Not a dramatic exit, no bright flare, no final gesture, just a quiet diminishing, as if a light in a distant room were slowly being turned down by a patient hand. Atlas left the sky the same way it entered it, calmly, steadily, with a restraint that felt almost deliberate, and in that fading something became clear, something we could not see while the object was still present above us. Atlas was never trying to teach us about itself. It was teaching us about the silence between questions, because once the object was gone, humanity was left alone with something far heavier than data or speculation. We were left with the awareness that we had been observed, and that awareness does not fade. Long after the last trajectory projection fell off the map, long after the final spectrographic readings were archived, long after the public fascination cooled into quiet myth, the feeling remained, a soft imprint, a shift, a before and after. As if Atlas pressed a thumb against the fabric of our species and left a gentle indentation that will not disappear for generations. The question, of course, is what the indentation was for. What was Atlas trying to shape? Not our technology that will keep evolving no matter what. Not our politics. Those change too quickly to measure. Not our faith. That is too varied, too personal. No. Atlas touched something deeper. Our posture toward the unknown. Before Atlas, the unknown was a distant abstraction, a concept of philosophy, a playground of imagination, a canvas for fear. After Atlas, the unknown became a presence, not a threat, not a promise, not a revelation, a presence, something quiet in the dark that no longer feels empty. And this presence raised a question humanity had been too young to hear until now. If the universe is watching, what does it want to see from us? It is a question with no edges, no single interpretation, no easy answer. But in a way, that is the answer, because Atlas didn't ask for faith. It didn't ask for fear. It didn't ask for worship. It didn't ask for surrender. It asked for reflection, It asked for the kind of self-awareness that only emerges when a species feels the weight of a gaze that is not its own. A gaze that is patient, a gaze that is distant, a gaze that evaluates not readiness, but the willingness to become ready. And through that lens, Atlas begins to look less like an anomaly and more like an invitation written in the only universal language: attention. Attention without panic, curiosity without arrogance, restraint without denial, imagination without delusion. These are not instructions, they are qualities. Qualities a civilization must carry before it can walk beyond its cradle. Atlas didn't arrive to push us across that threshold. It arrived to show us where the threshold is. A species does not mature by discovering answers. It matures by learning which questions matter. And perhaps the quiet brilliance of Atlas is that it forced humanity to ask the one question that begins every true contact. What must we become to be worth talking to? Not powerful, not united, not advanced, but aware. Aware that intelligence is not unique. Aware that silence can hold intent. Aware that the universe may be older, wiser, and far more patient than any story we have told ourselves. Awareness is the first step, and Atlas gave us that step not through revelation but through restraint. You can almost imagine it now, moving through the cold beyond our sight, carrying whatever purpose brought it here, unhurried, unmoved, content in the knowledge that its task was completed the moment humanity asked a new kind of question. A question that doesn't point outward, but inward. A question that doesn't seek a message, but offers one. A question that will echo in every generation that remembers this moment in the sky. If something allowed itself to be seen, without speaking, without landing, without demanding anything at all, then what does that say about what the universe expects from those who notice it? The answer is not given to us. It is given through us. Because contact doesn't begin when two civilizations exchange words. Contact begins when one civilization becomes quiet enough to listen for meaning inside the silence of another. Atlas did not break the silence. It shaped it. And in doing so, it left humanity with the one truth we are finally old enough to understand. We have not been waiting for the universe to speak. The universe has been waiting for us to listen. There is a quiet part of the human mind that awakens only after the story ends. Not during the discovery, not during the tension, not even during the final revelation, but in the long, echoing stillness that follows. That stillness is where the meaning settles. And in the days and weeks after Atlas faded from our sky, that stillness stretched across the world like a low tide, a gentle withdrawal of noise, a dimming of urgency, a soft clearing of space inside the collective human mind. The object was gone, but the silence it shaped remained, and inside that silence something unexpected began to unfold. People found themselves thinking differently, not louder, quieter, not faster, deeper. It was as if Atlas had placed a single question in the sky and left humanity to wrestle with the weight of it long after its tail slipped beyond our instruments. A question not about the object, but about ourselves. What does it mean to be noticed by something that does not speak? It is a strange feeling, to be acknowledged without being addressed, to be observed without being judged, to be measured without being guided. For the first time in our history, we glimpsed the shape of an intelligence that interacts not through messages, but through presence. Presence that challenges us to rise, not because we are told to, but because we understand that something greater is watching quietly from just beyond our reach. And the more humanity sat with that realization, the more the world began to shift in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Astronomers found themselves working later into the night without knowing why. Writers and thinkers filled notebooks with ideas they couldn't quite articulate. Ordinary people, the ones who rarely looked up, found their eyes drifting toward the evening sky, as if expecting something else to step into view. Change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, Sometimes it rearranges the internal architecture of how a species thinks. That is what Atlas did. It reorganized humanity's sense of scale. We have spent thousands of years believing the unknown was either a threat or a myth, something to fear or something to worship, but Atlas was neither. It asked us to stand in the presence of something that refused to declare itself, and in that refusal, it opened a third path, one that civilizations rarely see unless they are ready. The path of quiet comprehension. A state where the unknown is not an enemy and not a fantasy, but a field of possibility that demands humility and balance. We began to sense, not understand, not decode, but sense, that the universe may communicate not with words, but with thresholds. Moments where something appears not to answer a question, but to reveal that the question itself is too small. And once a species realizes that, it cannot return to the worldview it held before, the old stories of isolation, of cosmic emptiness, of a universe indifferent to intelligence, begin to soften at the edges, not vanish, just soften. In their place grows a feeling that is difficult to name because humanity has never needed it before. The feeling of being potentially included in something larger than we can yet perceive. It is not belonging, not yet. It is the awareness that belonging might someday be possible. That alone can reshape a species. And as that awareness spread, our questions changed. We stopped asking, what was Atlas? And began asking, what are we, now that Atlas has been here? Because the presence of another intelligence, even one that stays silent, acts like a contour drawn around the human mind. A contour that shows us the borders of our understanding and the vastness of what lies beyond. And once you see the edge of your own comprehension, you begin to grow toward it instinctively, the way a tree grows toward light even when the sun is hidden behind clouds. Humanity began growing like that, not upward, inward. We started to question our assumptions about what intelligence is, about what communication could be, about what patience means on a cosmic scale. Because Atlas taught us something that no textbook ever could. Silence is not the absence of information. Silence is a medium. Silence is a shape. Silence is a form of contact that reveals the listener more than the speaker. In the months that followed, scientists revisited their models not because the data had changed, but because they had. People began to treat uncertainty not as an error, but as a condition, a natural, inevitable part of existing in a universe that is older and more complex than our language can hold. And yet, for all the calm introspection, for all the philosophical reshaping, for all the subtle cultural evolution, a quiet unease lingered beneath it all. A question that refused to dissolve no matter how much time passed. If Atlas was the first step, what is the second? Because every deliberate presence implies a deliberate follow-up. Every threshold crossed implies another waiting ahead. Every silence implies a space where sound might someday appear. Humanity began to understand that Atlas was not an answer. It was a beginning. The beginning of a new relationship between our species and the unknown, and beginnings carry responsibility. We realized collectively that we had been given a rare kind of gift. The gift of time. Time to think before the next step. Time to mature before the next encounter. Time to grow into the kind of species that can face the universe without trembling and without arrogance. Because if Atlas was a question, a test, a signal, a measurement, then we will not be judged by how we responded in the moment. We will be judged by who we become afterward. This is the unspoken challenge Atlas left behind. Become a civilization that can stand in the presence of the unknown without projecting fear or demanding certainty. Become a civilization that seeks understanding more than comfort, evidence more than reassurance, perspective more than dominance. Become a civilization worth continuing the conversation with. And the most haunting part of this entire story, the part that sits like a faint echo in the minds of those who watched Atlas most closely, is that the universe may not be waiting for us to solve anything. It may simply be waiting for us to listen well enough that solving becomes possible. In that sense, the true legacy of Atlas is not the data it left behind, but the silence it reshaped. Silence that is no longer empty. Silence that is no longer frightening. Silence that is no longer a void to be filled with myth or denial. Silence that feels like a presence. And in that presence, humanity took its first step, not into space, but into awareness. The kind of awareness that civilizations reach only once, the kind that cannot be unwound, the kind that prepares a species for whatever comes next. And whether the next visitor arrives tomorrow, or in 1,000 years, or never at all, Atlas has already done its work. It opened the door not to contact but to possibility, and once a civilization glimpses possibility, real, quiet, undeniable possibility, it can never again believe that the universe is empty. Not after Atlas. Not after the silence that followed. Not after the reflection it left behind. Humanity is no longer alone in the way it once believed. We are alone the way a child is alone moments before someone turns the light on.